I'm going to ask each of the people on the panel who we haven't heard from yet today just to give, just in a few brief 4 or 5 minutes, just give a little sense of their thinking on this topic, on how we can engage the public more effectively with the work of your companies, the environmental agenda as a whole, the green economy, and ensure that people translate that, that pent-up interest they have in this agenda into genuine action, voting intentions and support for, and indeed demand for, the kind of technologies that your companies all develop. Let's start down the end then, in that case, with Sue.
Well, thank you very much. So the exam question that I think we've been given as a panel is, how do we ensure that the environment is a factor in the 2015 election? And I wanted to put a slightly alternative thought there, which is that it isn't an election issue. The environment's never an election issue. But it's a crucial issue of competence and credibility for all the parties. So while this might not be the pinch issue in the leaders' debate, a party that doesn't look like it can look after the environment is unlikely to be seen as a credible party of government. And that's where the environmental issues sit in elections, which doesn't make them any less important. It just means they're slightly differently pitched. It's hugely, as we just heard in that fascinating presentation, it's hugely relevant to citizens rather than voters. It's the same people with slightly different hats on. And the difficult point that we're increasingly facing and are aware of is that citizens are growing very, very disengaged from politics. We saw this in acutely brought to focus in the Scottish referendum issue. People really want to be re-engaged, but they're feeling low levels of trust and low levels of involvement, and policy making is increasingly looking like it's carried out by an elite group isolated from the rest of society somewhere in Whitehall. And this is an enormous problem, not just for politicians, but for people who care about the environment and other results of good policy making. So this is the context that we're going into the next general election with. We're also going into it with the legacy of several years of difficult working conditions, unstable incomes, people feeling very squeezed. So the next election is going to be a rather defensive one. It's going to be more about stability and security, whoever wins, and whatever the debates are, than a great big, enormous, shiny change mantra, the Sarah Palin, hopey changey moment thing. Probably isn't going to be up there in the debate. So the environment will have to fit into that. Fortunately, it can fit into that. We need a much more intelligent integration between the economy and the environment for these debates to really work and have salience. And we need people to feel re-engaged and like they have access to and a say in the policies that govern their lives. There's a really clear set of options for the environment to be part of that improved debate. I'll just pull out 3, and actually they do, I promise we didn't liaise, but they do lead from some of the things we just heard about. So one thing, for example, the cost of living. International food and energy prices have cost the householder an extra £1,000 a year off their bills in the last few years. And without this effect, real wages could have risen in the past decade. An intelligent resource stewardship policy and programme, well supported through government and implemented with good businesses, could help control these prices and protect businesses and customers from resource price shocks. And that is something that it would need to be translated, as has been pointed out, into something that people understand. But that approach, rather than a linear economy that traps us into only using resources once and putting over £3 billion a year's worth of recoverable resources into landfill every year, which is lost from people's pockets, that kind of approach would link the environment and the economy. That's just one example. Another is infrastructure decisions. The next government's going to come into power with a big wodge of cash in their back pocket for capital investments in shiny new things. Well, new airports and new dual roads aren't going to protect us from energy price rises, things like that. They're going to have other benefits, but they won't help us on many things that are causing people problems and are coming out in the polls. Capital investment in our existing infrastructure, which threatens to collapse every winter, would probably pay much higher economic and environmental dividends than those. So can you imagine a winter with a robust train network and well-insulated, non-leaky homes, sustainable flood defences? These things would make for a very slow press winter, but they might make for a good political and human winter. So that kind of investment programme would link economic and environmental agendas. And the final example I wanted to pull out for linking the environment and the things that people are going to vote on is the places that people love. It's constantly astounding to me that in a country with such a high level of support for the natural environment and such a good suite of laws to protect it, that we're doing so badly. 60% of our species are in decline, 10% of them are headed for extinction. Children are growing up without access to the natural environment, and there's a wealth of study after study that shows that this leads to domestic violence, crime rates going up, health, mental and physical health problems, low educational attainment. All these things come from not having the appropriate access to nature and the green environment that we should have, and we know this. And yet somehow we're not getting ourselves into a state where we can move to implement the laws that we have or come up with a new approach that will address these problems. And there again, we've got the economy and the environment aligning in ways that will speak to the voters, will speak to the electorate, and the new government could work with business to tackle in a new approach.
Fascinating overview. Just one very quick question before we move on to the next panelist. I agree entirely this idea of competence, it should just be a competence issue. How does the UKIP phenomenon fit into that? Because I think even their biggest fans would not pretend that they're putting towards a pitch of just ultra competence on these issues. They're just, and yet they're still commanding a large chunk of the vote, or a chunk of the vote that's large enough to move the other parties.
They are, but I'm not sure that they're doing it on environmental grounds. I mean, it's sometimes dressed up with an environmental hat on. But it's quite often a protectionist agenda. In fact, it's usually a protectionist agenda that they're speaking to rather than a genuine environmental agenda. There is an overlap in some respects, especially when you talk about places that people love. There is an overlap there, but protectionism tends to be shorter term and environmentalism tends to be longer term. So I wouldn't say that they're coming from the same place.
But their lack of focus on the environment isn't ruling them out with many people.
No, but again, I think we've heard that the environment isn't going to be the primary thing that motivates voters to vote. It's going to be other issues. It's going to be the economy, immigration, things like, you know, whatever the individual is most concerned about. But what I'm arguing is that a party that cannot look after the environment is not one that will be seen as competent to rule for most people.
Charles, to introduce yourself and give a brief insight.
Yeah, thank you, James. Hello, everybody. Charles Perry is my name. I want to talk about this theme of engaging with the voters or the customers or just generally other people. Because after all, I think we forget that part of human nature is the word nature. And what is part of our nature in terms of how we engage with people is often just thought about on an intellectual level. So we spend our lives sort of having these intellectual arguments about nuclear or this or that, fracking, but we don't really tend to go into other levels. So, you know, besides mental, of course, we've got physical, emotional, and spiritual levels of engagement. We don't often get into those types of conversations. And I think it's about time we did, because on the one hand, you've got lots of horror scare stories about all the things that could go wrong. But on the other hand, we've got a very weak level of dialogue about the engaging around the emotional level. So I want to talk a bit about soul. You know the Billy Joel song, It's All About Soul? How many of you know that song? Can you put up your hands if you know that song? What? I can't see, please. All about soul, it's all about a deeper emotion. Now, why does Billy Joel sing about that? And what is the relevance of soul to this conversation? You may or may not know that an icon, a legend, and a mentor and inspiration to me growing up in South Africa just passed away the last couple of days. Dr. Ian Player. To me, much more famous than his brother Gary Player, the golfer. Older brother to Gary, Dr. Ian Player, but like Dr. Richard Leakey in Africa, is one of the foremost conservationists. Whether you speak to Prince Charles or Jonathan Porritt, they'll tell you about Ian Player and Lawrence van der Post's influence on the world. And what did Ian Player set out to do? He set out to reconnect people like us to wilderness areas. When you go to the bush, when you sit around a campfire, when you listen to the lion roar or the wildebeest, you kind of reconnect with your soul. It's no coincidence that all the major religions, whether they be Judaism with Moses and John the Baptist, Jesus and Muhammad, they all sort of went into the wilderness to basically look at what was important, to go through a period of personal suffering and anxiety before they came out and led people to the promised land. We seem to have forgotten about this vision of the promised land. You don't see much from the coalition government about a narrative of a promised land, of a sustainable future. I mean, compare the government's narrative to Jonathan Porritt's book, The World We Made, set in 2050, which I highly recommend, which he really struggles with what the world might look like in 2050 if we get things right, rather than all the horror stories about if we get things wrong. Because, of course, as other great leaders like Henry V taught us at the Battle of Agincourt, we have to paint a vision of a bright future to get through the nights of the long knives, the dark forest of the soul. And so what is this about discovering who we are? Human nature. We seem to have forgotten that we are part of nature. We are not separate from nature. We are not above nature. Whatever you do to one strand, remember, reverberates around the web of life. We are part of nature. I called my business Second Nature, which I've recently sold because of making sustainability second nature. Intrinsic, instinctive, the way we behave without even thinking, because why we care about our children and our grandchildren and about future generations. No point if we've used up all the fossil fuels, we've used up all the minerals, if we've used up all the water, and we've destroyed the national parks and the animals. What kind of world is that? That's the opposite, the scare stories. So how many of you have seen the following films? Just quickly raise your hands. Gorillas in the Mist, Blood Diamond, Constant Gardener, Erin Brockovich, and more recently, two films, Serena, just on at the moment. No, Serena, great film, by the way, right on at the moment. And another film, Virunga, a Leonardo DiCaprio film, just out now. Virunga. Where's Virunga? People know where Virunga is?
Rwanda?
Congo, close. National Park. What's happening there right now?
Is it the oil exploration and gorilla sanctuary?
Correct. And what's happening to the gorillas? They're being decimated. Like what often happens in these films. These films catch our attention. These stories of Erin Brockovich and Sigourney Weaver, they catch our attention because this is about a conflict, between people who don't give a damn, basically, and people who realize that part of our custodianship role in being on this planet is to guard our resources for future generations. So back to environment. It's obviously part of the broader sustainable development, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. People like Gro Brundtland, great leader in 1985 on this stuff, John Elkington, John Porritt. We know the rest. Well, what's happened to getting people engaged on an emotional level with this? Now, Ian Player just died. It's a very sad moment, but as the Zulu proverb goes, and I just want to read this to you because he said he became not the master but the pupil because he learnt everything he knew from Makubu Ntombela. And he wrote a book just before he died called Zulu Wilderness, Heart and Soul. We talk about the mind, these intellectual arguments. What about heart and soul? Here is the words of a current Zulu legend. May the fruits from the eternal garden of his gifts be ever more abundant. What do people like Ian Player teach us? What's the whole purpose of his life was to help people rediscover their soul through a wilderness experience. It's about being human. We are not separate from nature. We are part of nature. We often forget that. Contrast Black Friday with what it means to go into the wilderness and sit around a bushfire and listen to the animals and breathe in the clean air. That's the two extremes. And we've clearly gone closer to the Black Friday example than the Ian Player example. The last speech I heard he made just before he died, he said this at the Royal Geographic Society. He said, civilization has become synonymous with being divorced from nature. If we want to get voters engaged, we have to reconnect ourselves with ourselves, which means rediscover the natural inside ourselves, the nature in human nature. The coalition government set out to be the greenest government ever, all the stuff that we fell for. I fell for, lots of us fell for. 4 years in, all their promises of clarity, confidence, and continuity, take energy, 5 ministers in 4 years, debacle. Now you can't even build a wind farm onshore, stopped. Solar, way down, from 20 gigawatts to 12 gigawatts. The ambition is pathetic from the greenest government ever. I'll be interested, maybe you disagree with me. So how many of you, hands up, give this government 5 out of 10 and more on greenest government ever? Please put up your hands. James Murray, the only person in the room. So isn't that amazing? 99% say that the coalition has got less than 5 out of 10 on greenest government ever. Yet David Cameron stood up in New York at the United General Assembly and told all the presidents in the room, I believe we have delivered on our promise of greenest government ever.
It's absolutely fascinating speech and fully engaging. There's a lot of thinking going on in exactly this area now around the really interesting reading I've done recently on intrinsic and extrinsic values, and this idea that the intrinsic values that we basically say are all the good things make you healthier, less stressed, happier, and so forth. And it's exactly what you're saying, this idea of this connection with our natural environment, with the family, with hearth and home, and the nature around us. How do you turn that into, given the topic of today, how do you turn that into an argument that will reach out to policymakers and politicians, and indeed other people in the public in general, without sounding spiritual and traditional sort of hippie, fluffy, all the things that have been thrown at the green agenda and in many ways have undermined the green agenda? How do you actually get what is a very, very valuable narrative into language that will resonate with the policymakers and the politicians who would all nod along to all of that and then go, yeah, it's a bit soft, I'm leaving, that's not going in a manifesto, it's not going anywhere near a manifesto?
I think we have to learn from history. So many examples in history, and we can only sort of look at the future in context of the past that has led to the present, as Adlai Stevenson once said. And in historical terms, who are the people who've done that? Who are the people who've mobilized the world to change for the better? And we look to the Mandelas and the William Wilberforces and the Winston Churchills and the spiritual leaders, Jesus Christ and others, who mobilize. And how do they mobilize? By appealing not to the mind, but to the heart and to the soul. Because you've got to capture, of course, hearts, minds, and souls, but we just say that as if we know what we're talking about. We don't. We don't really think about what does it mean to engage people on an emotional and spiritual level with a higher purpose. I mean, Unilever is actually an interesting business that is doing that. They're engaging on a higher purpose, and Paul Polman has just backed the establishment of the Purposeful Business Institute, with Jeff MacDonald leading that. He was at Unilever for 25 years, just left to set up the Purposeful Business Institute. We're part of that. It's about having a purpose, but purpose is about the hearts and the souls.
Fascinating. I'm sure we'll explore it more in the questions to come. Just finally, Ian, as a fellow journalist, what's your take on how we can start to engage the public, your readers, with some of these issues?
Thanks. I'm the only non-expert on the environment in the room, but I was very interested in Desiree's comment that environment doesn't even make the top 10 issues, and I totally agree with that. Perhaps I'm here on a good day, because today I edit a paper a morning paper circulates throughout the whole of the southwest, and the big story today is, of course, flooding. And driving down from Bristol, I was listening to lots of radio programmes, and every person interviewed was basically saying that the politicians aren't really telling the truth. And, you know, when you engage the public, and I try to do that every day, they want to know the truth. And we're talking here about environment. Let me talk very briefly about the flooding in Somerset. That was my paper last Friday, where David Cameron told us, New Rivers Authority, we're going to give you all the money for that. It was costing something over £20 million. And then suddenly they decided, no, that wasn't really correct. So we go along to Eric Pickles, say, what's going on here, Minister? Suddenly they change their mind, oh yes, we'll give you the money. Now, if we're going to engage the public, first thing we need to be clear on, politically, tell the truth. They rarely do that. Second thing, we've really got to engage people, and going back to Desiree's presentation, on what they're interested in. What are they interested in? They're interested in some tips on their doorstep. They're interested in plastic bags. They're interested in allotments. They're interested in what their children get up to at school. If you go into schools and you deal with certain agricultural shows like the Three Counties, who do huge amounts for children, you see that young people are extraordinarily interested in the environment. Absolutely amazing. They're real experts. We've got a lot of grandchildren. They know a lot about things that I don't. They know lots and lots of stuff that we don't even envisage. Do we engage with them? I don't think we do at all. Green capital. Bristol is the green capital this year. My newspaper's published from there. They've had quite a tough job. They got a guy who sold a lot of sponsorship, got in about £1 million. They sacked him a few weeks ago because they realised he wasn't the man to engage the community. How do you engage a community like Bristol into green issues? That's where the problem is. So they're just trying to do that, and they launched this in January. So, they've got an uphill struggle. In a nutshell, I don't see the environment being any, as Sue said earlier, any sort of top of political agenda for politicians at all. But in my area, the politicians who are fighting for people who've been flooded out, fighting for people who are paying double the insurance and all this sort of thing, a lot of those, I have to say, Duncan, are Lib Dem MPs as well. A lot of those MPs are going to be re-elected because that's part of these people's lives. I don't know if any of you have been down to these flooded areas, wherever. I have. When you're in 2 feet of water and you're not even in your home for Christmas, some of them over a year later, that's pretty bad. And when you see politicians strolling down, in case of David Cameron, he's been down to the Somerset now 3 times, saying things that don't turn out to be the truth. Do you engage with that person? I don't think you do. So the honest answer to the question is this. We need to get down to some grassroots ideas on the environment. I'm very, very keen with young people and encouraging them. I'm very keen to get commercial companies involved as well. Commercial companies are really quite good at own ideas. We rerun a lot of awards. We do run awards where there's an environmental award locally. So I'd encourage companies who are here today to get more involved. But, the biggest thing is to communicate. And in terms of the environment industry, I don't think you do that brilliantly. It's often an afterthought. Let's get down and dirty with the people who read my paper and the papers that your families read. So more engagement quickly.
It's a perennial complaint is that the engagement and communication from the entire green movement, I take in green businesses and the green NGO community, is just staggeringly confused. It's not bad, it just jumps in lots of different directions, dealing with different things all the time, and there's a real lack of focus and clarity. Hopefully we can explore some of that in this session now. We've got about half an hour or so for questions for the panel, or indeed points more generally on this key topic of how we can make the environment a factor, or more effectively a factor in next year's election. The gentleman here has his hand up first.
Charles, thank you very much for the South African story. I had to smile. I lived in Africa for 15 years. I lived in the countryside without electricity. I listened to the lions, to my own soul. Am I a better person? No, I'm not. See,
You've been corrupted by the city.
No, I think I do understand what you say, and I think we all sympathize, but we heard a bit earlier that 471 cities worldwide contribute to more than 50% of GDP, and in 30 years we have 70% of people who live in urbanized areas. People who don't have the money to go on safaris and can't even afford to have a cottage in the countryside. And as it is clear that environmental issues are not an electoral issue, the key issue seems to be leadership that goes beyond an electoral mandate. And I can't see anything else that what has been presented earlier on this C40, that you need a vision for people who live in the cities, that they have a level of nature, access to clean air, clean water, some kind of areas where they can relax and are out of a confined urban settlement, which will be the future of mankind. And it is important to look back. We had this debate already in old Rome, where people were complaining about the decadent life in the city and the nice life in the countryside. But the future is in big urban conglomerates, and our human nature just doesn't cope with the real changes. And I think, again, the only vision that we should, let's say, support is a political leadership that looks into this future of mankind. And I think this is the major challenge politically.
It's a fascinating part. I thought that the presentation earlier about from the C40, you just had one slide at the end about this idea of biodiversity within cities and making it more engaged. I mean, Charles, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, Martin, thank you very much. Very important question. Mahatma Gandhi said we've got to put the village back in the city. And what do you think he meant by that? He meant exactly what you were referring to. We've got to help people living in big urban areas, because of the problem is increasing urbanization in the sense that you were describing. We help people in urban areas feel the village of the countryside. And that means having access to the things that you're talking about, but also having the knowledge and the appreciation of where things come from, where their milk comes from, where their chicken comes from, where their meat comes from, what's the difference between venison and beef, all these types of things. And of course, with increasing urbanization and ignorance, you have that disconnect with where things come from. So you don't have the appreciation of the web of life. So if you do something to one strand, you don't have the appreciation that that has a ripple effect through the whole web of life. So you can't start to remedy those negative actions. Now, when Jonathan Porritt started his career, what did he start doing? Inner city comprehensive teaching, taking kids out into the countryside to rediscover. It doesn't have to be far away. Literally, getting just 45 minutes out of London, going to a farm and actually interacting with animals and the countryside, as you put it. That is a wilderness experience of a kind. It's not exactly what Dr. Ian Player meant by a wilderness experience, but it's still as good as we can do right now, which is a lot better than being completely ignorant and disconnected or divorced from nature, because we're not separate from nature. We are part of nature. In the 60s, scientists started to come up with this new theory that humans were separate from nature. And I think ever since then, we've been on a slippery slope.
Interestingly, on a policy level, this seems to be one of the few issues that does unite all the parties. No policy exchange, centre-right think tank doing a lot of work on the value of parks and urban spaces, and then you're seeing
natural capital,
Labour as well coming in with it. I mean, is there, Matthew, do you see this as potentially translating into there are actual practical policies that can be put in place to enable what Martin was touching upon?
I think it's getting from where we are to where we'd like to be is always the challenge, isn't it? It was interesting when Liz Truss gave her speech to Policy Exchange on the environment a couple of weeks ago. She emphasised very much the local space agenda and helping people connect with nature, partly for very good reasons, as Charles has said, but also I think because it was a way to get away from talking about policy issues where people actually have to do things they might not want to do in a more direct sense. So she said nothing about wasting resources, because she didn't want to get sucked into debates about how much recycling should we do, how many bins do you have. I think she was trying to sort of move away from areas where nothing about climate change really, because she didn't want to get into debates about do people fly too much, do we have airport expansion. And I think you're going to see politicians trying to align themselves with that agenda that Charles has set out, but as you were alluding to, without actually, partly doing it to try and avoid some of the more immediate practical challenges we face.
The environment it's not going to be a leading issue at the election, but health is, local flooding in floodplain areas is, education is, pollution is, all of these things in urban areas can be addressed with a good green agenda that looks at the green infrastructure, provides sustainable drainage solutions, provides access to green space, provides deprived areas with high quality environments which are known and have been measured to have an impact on social well-being, mental health, crime rates, etc. So I think there is a connection despite the relative positioning. We mustn't get too distracted on whether people are going to put vote environment as the top of their reasons to vote for a particular party, because all the parties can make use of the science here to address the things that are going to be the primary motivators. Interestingly, a group of NGOs, the RSPB in fact led this, produced the very first baseline of connection to nature in children last year. And interestingly, London had higher connection to nature than some of the rural areas. Wales had the lowest area, which many of us associate with lovely walking holidays and nature. So there are other factors at play here about whether children are growing up with the benefits of access to nature and a connection to nature. And it's also worth pointing out that some of our countryside, I mean, we mustn't make the mistake of thinking all our countryside is beautiful and like a Garden of Eden and has no problems, and urban areas are the crime-ridden, grimy black spots of the nation with all the environmental problems. It's not the case at all. Countryside is also seeing major environmental problems, and just because you live there doesn't mean you're automatically going to have a high-quality environment on your doorstep, although you probably have more green. So I think if we're going to have comprehensive green policy that makes people's lives better, it needs to apply across urban areas. It needs to solve wider problems that people are also very troubled by, and it can. But it also mustn't just be wholly focused on urban areas. Rural areas are not just going to run themselves to a high standard without policy intervention, and at the moment that's not what we're getting.
We've all heard the cri de coeur from the panel and from Charles especially, and I think we agree with the motivation and the desire, but the question is, how do we get that into the policy? And John Cridland this morning said the solution was to make it uncontroversial, so everyone can adopt it, to make it universal for the politicians. And in fact, I think we can take it a step further. We make it something which they can stand on and feel as a safe place, because we know they're about to descend into playground politics, and it's not mine, it's yours, I want this, you want that. So we say to them, we know this is how politics works, but we want you to be grown up. And this is where the policy think tanks come in and where the newspapers come in, to say, we want you to be grown up, we want you to show us that you can have long-term, cross-party, environmental policy working, where we can come up with a long-term strategy that all parties can agree with, so that when they are backbiting and fighting with each other, they can look grown up too. And if we convince them it will help them look more grown up, then I think they might adopt that.
Would that work? Can that convert the political dialogue at all?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think my bigger challenge is around the context piece again, and going back to really understanding what real people are experiencing and the relationship between that and the policy platforms that people are going to stand on. I think it's slightly dangerous to say that the general public is ignorant and not informed. For me, the disconnect is in relation to the realities of what people are experiencing day to day and how that connects back to the policies that are being set and how people communicate about them. And that goes back to, again, the point around trust. So I'm not sure. I think my bigger concern is, again, around how the general public sees themselves and how platforms are being created and what policies end up looking like.
Really good point. I've got two comments on that. And the first one goes back to this point about engagement. So at the moment, there's low levels of trust in politics. That leads to politicians with a less secure mandate. That leads to less ability to make good decisions, and that makes them fall back on the short term. Environment's a long-term issue. So this absolutely mitigates against good environmental policy when we're in this situation. The first thing that the next government is going to have to do is rebuild that trust, give people a stake in policy making, let people feel like they've got representatives who want what they want and who will do the right thing for them, have stronger mandates. I know this is every politician's dream, but we really are getting to a point where it's ridiculous. And those politicians are going to be the ones that are able, from whatever colour, are going to be able to make long-term stable decisions for environmental progress. So that's one thing, and that's a really high priority for any government to address. The second one is that I've sat in a number of business meetings recently with politicians where they are using the business voice as a reason for not doing things, not hearing that businesses, quite often in the same meeting, are calling for more progress faster than the politicians are arguing for. Now, that's probably a confidence issue as well, or a not hearing. I don't quite know what it is, but it's a something issue. But progressive business voices need to get a lot more louder and a lot more unified so that politicians stop saying that this won't suit the business community, we can't do it. Because actually there's a mismatch in the voices there. I'm not saying all the time, I'm not saying every politician, but it's quite common that progressive ideas are knocked back because the business community wouldn't like it, where the business community is actually saying this and more. So we need to get that clear. The progressive business voice does need to be louder and more unified, I think, to help us go forward.
Absolutely. As someone who writes about this every single day, I cannot hammer home that point nearly hard enough. There is this massive, massive imbalance between the sort of traditional corporate thinking that certain ministers still just instinctively jump to which is not actually where the CBI sits anymore. It's certainly not where the EiC sits anymore, but they have a few people in their ear who say, we don't want that tax or we don't want that policy, and it's justification enough to stop the whole agenda. And the other key problem is, unfortunately, you cannot overstate the extent to which climate change and anything related to it has become a sort of political virility test for a actually still relatively small cabal of people on the right of the Conservative Party, but they have dragged others with them and turned it into that political virility test. And the only way to sort of dilute that problem is if the business community that traditionally has supported centre-right policies comes out and says, hang on, this is a centre-right policy. This is not something that's, socialist. This is actually something we need, and it's a huge, huge problem. Matthew, you deal with these issues every day, talking to policymakers. I mean, is that your take?
I think it's exactly right. As you say, there's often an assumption that mainstream business is anti-progressive environmental policy when it isn't even the case. I was part of the CBI team in the sort of mid-2000s, working with John Quidlin and others who made the CBI more progressive on climate change. And I remember being rung up once by someone quite senior in government on the sort of political advisor side, saying that there was sort of pressure from various NGOs and so on to go to an 80% carbon reduction target by 2050. It was then 60%. But it was being sort of pushed back because the CBI would be against. And I said, well, actually, we're not against. I'm at the CBI, and actually we're in favour of an 80% target. But there's just this unwritten assumption that there was, that mainstream business would be against these sort of things. I think it's a point we've heard a few times today. Those of us who share the same ideas need to, get our view across, and part of the purpose of putting on today's event was to do that. I think, as some of Desiree's slides showed, trying to relate environmental issues to very practical household issues such as jobs and growth, obviously is natural territory for EiC, and we need to do that better. And I think as well it's that long-term vision people have talked about. You always get the political cycles, the issues that suddenly come up, and unless they're very, very dramatic, like the sort of things some of Ian's readers have faced, they tend to outweigh these longer-term environmental issues.
I think it would be a good start to get a bunch of political leaders round a campfire in Africa for a start.
The next G8 maybe, that is instead of a big hotel, it would be around.
Let the lions eat them if they don't agree to a good climate.
And then we'll see survival of the fittest.
Is there end of that and leave them there? Is that the,
Yeah, leave them there and see who else we've got left behind. But no, if you look at great political leaders, and this is where business and politics come together. You look at Wilberforce, Mandela, Gandhi, Churchill. They made the moral case. Okay, at the moment, none of these leaders make the moral case because their values are in question, because they don't walk the talk, so they lack credibility. So they know they can't really talk about the moral case because they don't have a leg to stand on. But the people that we truly trust in history are the people that made the moral case, and we could believe in them, and we could then follow them. So it is back to Martin's point about leadership. We've got to look for people that we can believe in and that we can follow, who make the moral case and are not scared of making the moral case, because the business case is well and good, but we need the moral case in addition to the business case. And that's where business and politics work together. And again, Paul Polman has shown us one route of how to do this, how to bring the moral and the business case together into the purpose of Unilever, sustainable living for the people who don't have access to clean water, blah, blah, basic goods. And that's what we should all strive to do, walking the talk, and out of that, homegrown leadership. And we do need a new generation of leaders. I think it is back to your point about youth. We need to look to the youth, see where the examples are, and try and reconnect the youth with nature so they can rediscover their soul and lead and become moral leaders like the Wilberforces, Mandelas, Churchills, and Gandhis.
Ian, back to the original question on the political side, and I mean, do you, for your readers, is there sort of environmental agenda issues that you think would be vote winners, that would?
Absolutely. I mean, for those of you know the West Country, this is a fantastic area. Many people, obviously, in the cities have second homes there. People retire there for that reason. So a lot of those have the environment at their heart. It's interesting, isn't it, when you talk about leadership, look at the Environment Minister's post. How many changes have we had there recently? And look at what has caused those people to disappear. What has caused them to disappear mainly is that they had quite major disagreements. And why? Because those people have held strong views, and the environment, nature, everything, causes strong views. I think this is a great subject, and I think your question is a really, really good question. But how do you solve it? How do you get government ministers really thinking the environment is a vote winner? I think you've got to lose the word environment, bluntly. I think in areas that my paper covers, and from Gloucestershire right down to Dorset, that means all sorts of things. It means floods. Yes, it does mean the surroundings. It means all sorts of farming-related situations. It's a huge subject. And there are many, many good MPs here who are really experts in their fields. And I think what does happen is that these MPs are often ignored. When the Prime Minister comes down, they get a pat on the head, oh yeah, you're doing a great job, and it works. But in the long term, I don't think they're really noticed.
No, so keep on a business green, we write on every single day. It's not green technology, it's better technology, isn't it? It's better policies, it's more a quality of life agenda. I promised the chap at the back.
The risk from flooding, both in the UK and abroad, is coming as much from the densification of our urban centres as from climate change. So increase in people and assets in the floodplain. Cities tend to be near rivers and in coastal areas, and with surface water or pluvial flooding, you can live at the top of a hill but still be, at risk from flooding. But one thing that's also clear is that there seems to be a disconnect between government and the insurance industry when it comes to reducing the vulnerability side of things, the vulnerability of urban populations at the individual property level. There's a finite amount of money in the pot for flood defence. You can't defend everywhere. The general population has always thought that flooding is a government issue, but actually now, I think we need to encourage individuals to take more responsibility for protecting themselves against natural hazards. But many of my clients in insurance are still just replacing new for old after a flood event, rather than investing in betterment, which can often be the same or slightly increased cost. So installing floodable for floors or everything else. Flood defence grants from the government, £5,000 after the floods for individual property owners, they're just not being uptaken. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that issue of betterment, how government can work closer with the insurance industry to have betterment of the building stock, and what we can do to get individuals to take greater responsibility for themselves.
It's a key complex question that underpins a lot of flood policy. Sue?
This is an area that's absolutely crying out for some political leadership, because this is an area where things are changing. So all the policies that say things will stay the same are doomed to fail, but that's probably what most people, especially the poor buggers who have been flooded, want to hear. However, as you said, we're in a situation where there are a couple of different drivers, and in different places there are different drivers of change, but the overall effect is, whether you're on the coast, in the Somerset levels, where else flood? All the other places that flooded, there are different factors driving increased flood risk. We know that we're facing it, so things can't stay the same. We're not going to be able to build high enough walls, dredge enough rivers. Things are not going to stay the same. Now that's a nightmare, because it means some people might be living in places which can't be defended from flooding anymore. What's the solution? Well, having a vision would be a great start. It was fascinating last year that, it goes back to your question, that there was a crisis. It affected people's lives. It was absolutely awful. I went down to the Somerset levels. And what we saw was an absolute mudslinging match from the leaders, rather than sensible, evidence-based decision-making about where to go. It was quite appalling. So what we do need is a better understanding of where can be defended and where cannot be defended. And we have actually got that in the Environment Agency's strategy. We know what we can afford to defend and what we can't afford to defend. That wasn't supported by government, and what we don't have in those areas which can't be defended is a proactive plan for what to do about it. So if we can't defend some coastal areas, which we know we can't, and some low-lying places with very little infrastructure like the Somerset Levels, what happens in those places? What about the people that live there? What about their livelihoods? What's the positive vision for change for those areas, and who is going to lead it? And that has been left wide open. It's politically almost untouchable in some areas. The insurance industry, I think, is currently being a bit victim-y, but actually could be part of a strong voice holding the government to account, to do a bit more, think a bit more clearly, be less defensive, be more proactive. Throwing money at somewhere that's already underwater for increased dredging and pump draining is not the answer, but that's currently what's happening. And this is where the environment does become a voting issue. It takes a crisis to make the environment into a voting issue. The floods did it last year, and I'm sure Desire's got loads of polls that suddenly show 3/4 of people thought flooding and climate were a major problem, which hadn't thought that the previous November. That's what it takes to make the environment a voting issue, but we don't want that. We don't want those crises making the environment into a voting issue. We want proactive and positive leadership before it turns into a crisis. So I do think the insurance industry has a role to play here in ramping up the pressure for a better forward-looking solution.
Politically, though, is it ever possible for a minister, I mean, Lord Smith sort of found this last year, is it ever possible to say, actually, that area, sorry, that's not viable. If you want to insure that, you insure it yourself, and the insurance company set a market rate, and it'll be very, very high because you're very high risk. I mean, is that ever...
It depends. That can't be the whole answer. So there's a place in Wales, and somebody here might know it, I can't remember the name of it, there's a place in Wales where there's been a decision that the coastal defences will not be maintained, which puts a village basically on track to be underwater in 50 years. That's a political decision. If the Environment Agency had been backed up by the government, it might have been possible to work with communities, work with all the various actors to come up with a positive forward-looking plan. But he was hung out to dry, and there was no vision.
Just on the point around how do we get individual citizens to act, I think, again, there's a lot of really useful evidence around how behavioural insight and behavioural science needs to be enacted. So, for example, in and around pensions, well, we would hope that logically people would understand it's quite important to save, but people don't. And there's a whole host of reasons why they don't, hence the move to auto-enrollment, for example. And there's a huge amount of behavioural insight in relation to flooding in particular and why people behave why they do and when they do. And part of what we need to be thinking about is what's the role for leadership in terms of making good decisions on behalf of people to make sure that they're safe, whether that comes from industry, whether that comes from government.
I'd like to ask whether we're asking the right question. Is the question actually about how we mobilise collectively as an industry with other interested parties, perhaps NGOs and citizens groups, who want to achieve things and actually work around the politicians? Or how relevant is the 2015 election to actually getting things done?
I think that's a really good question, because I think the people need to come together, regardless of who you work for. The people need to come together with an alternative manifesto, because we're all pissed off with Whitehall, basically, right? So what is that alternative manifesto, and how can we organise ourselves around an alternative manifesto? Now, there are various initiatives going on at the moment that you may or may not be aware of that you can get yourselves involved in with alternative manifestos to basically show up the political parties and how disconnected they are from reality. But in times of great urgency or crisis, I mean, leadership comes to the fore. Why? Because I love the Chinese for the word crisis, made up of two characters, danger and opportunity. And real leaders understand the danger, and they lead people into the new world, the opportunity to move from one era to another, to move from slavery beyond slavery, to move from fossil fuels beyond petroleum. I used to work for BP, and it's very tragic. We made some progress, and then it was cut off by Tony Hayward, unfortunately, after I left. But this leadership needs to continue with visionary business and political people, but the only way to really hold them to account, back to your question, is we need the people, in terms of people power, to come up with an alternative manifesto. We elected them, and we should hold them to it and say it's not good enough.
Matthew, does the election matter next year?
Yeah, it's interesting, I thought, in this morning's session, the kick-off session, when most of the speakers were actually talking more in bottom-up terms. So you had John Cridland talking about the individual specific things which SMEs could do around energy efficiency. You had Julia Groves talking about crowdfunding and people moving their savings around. You had Paul from TUC talking about the role of employees could play in that. So I think it's it is easy for sort of policy people like me to get hung up on legislation, elections, and so on. Having said that, I sort of think, you do need leadership, and at the moment we let politicians to be our leaders. They may not do a very good job, but that's where leadership resides. And I think in the sort of 2006-07, when climate change suddenly went from being a minority interest to being a major political issue, that was partly driven by people like Blair saying we've got the EU chairmanship, we've got the G8 chairmanship at the same time, we're going to make climate change a big UK initiative in the Climate Change Act. And that did actually then, businesses that I was talking to at the time did respond to what politicians were saying. So I think, elections, are perhaps less significant in this arena than we sometimes think, but I still think politicians have a key role to play.
I think where's the leadership coming from and how do we work together are absolutely critical questions. Politicians need a mandate to act. So I think probably lots of people were nodding when Duncan put up his Lib Dem manifesto. Lots of key points, lots of conversations with people, lots of good ideas in there. If Duncan was Prime Minister, which he won't be, so I'm allowed to say it, if you didn't have a mandate, unless something's changed that I really don't know anything about, if you didn't have a mandate and the support of business and the support of the public, you wouldn't be able to bring any of that to life. That's what politicians need. They're not all terrible. They're not, it's a bit easy to fall into the habit of saying it's all awful, they don't understand, they're all disconnected. Well, some of them are. Some of them are fantastic. Some of them desperately want to do the right thing. Some of them have got a very, very strong vision and all the evidence needed, but they don't feel they've got the support. They're attacked by the press. It's become a fantastic football to kick a politician. Public don't feel like they've got any connection, so they don't know why they should trust them, so they don't give them support. And business are divided, frankly, and that's really not helping. So the job is to build the mandate for the next government to take the right decisions on the environment. Yeah. Now, there are some parties where I'd be quite pessimistic if they got in, but most of the most realistic options for the next government are going to be people who are perfectly capable of making really good decisions and showing that environmental leadership, possibly in alliance with colleagues across the Channel. That's all completely within our gift, but we need to provide politicians and the next government with the mandate to be strong leaders on the environment. So I do think you're right. I think the business community could come together much more clearly and say much more strongly, we will support you to make these decisions with long-term goals in mind. And I do think, I'd be fascinated to hear what Ian thinks about the role of the press in making or breaking the ability of politicians to make decisions, because there has been some quite negative influence as well as some sensible and good investigative journalism, which I don't think has helped.
Well, can I just say, why doesn't your organisation, taking Charles' point, do its own alternative manifesto? Put it up. Let's put it to the politicians. I'd run that. I'll actually do that. And, a lot of newspapers would. Why don't you do it? Because your organisation, with lots and lots of different talent, why not do it?
If you get the EiC and Aldersgate and Green Alliance and Friends of the Earth, for example, to collaborate on this mandate, which I call an alternative manifesto, then we, the people, can get involved. I mean, how many letters are we writing collectively? How engaged are we? I'm half British and half South African. The Brits, in my experience, tend to wait till the 11th hour before they act. Look at the war. May 1940 was when we got Churchill in. The war started in September. We need to get really much more involved.
I'm Bill Baker. I'm an ex-public servant with a large local authority and the Environment Agency, and now I'm doing it on my own. And but what I'm beginning to feel is that people on the panel have talked about what we need is a people's manifesto. Did you not know that we live in a democracy? And do you not understand that the political system that exists is open to everyone to partake in? And what's wrong is that there's so much denigration of all the political parties and anything any politician says, and we've heard it all today, that's the reason why it doesn't work. But it would work if people who really did feel strongly about life and society and everything else would actually go and join one of the political parties. And if you do that, you can have something like 500 times more influence than if you merely all you do is go and vote at an election. And I'd like people to really think about that, especially people with an environmental issue, because I think you could be much more effective doing that than coming to meetings like this even. I mean, I enjoy coming to meetings like this, but really, I mean, that's a piece of advice drawn from a lot of years of experience in trying to make things happen.
It is a very, very good point, and I will say that today I think the Green Party issued a press release saying their membership has doubled inside this year. I think it's up to tens of thousands of people now. It's drastically increased in the past year and is now outstripping or coming close to some of the mainstream parties for exactly your point of actually getting engaged. I mean, would the panel like to see more of that kind of democratic involvement with the mainstream parties or with some of the parties?
Bill, I'm not so sure that that's the solution, because the whole point of reconnecting, whether it be people and nature or reconnecting the different aspects of sustainable development, so environment, society, and economy or finance, is to go beyond just party politics. The Green Party is one dimension. The Tory, none of these on their own can solve the problem. We need a cross-party consensus, which is back to the People's Manifesto. The problem is party politics, and we've got to go beyond party politics and actually take a sustainability approach rather than just an environmental approach. And that's, I think, much more profound.
Sue, Green Alliance's new strategy is very much focused on public engagement and public policy.
There's two things. So the Green Alliance brought out it wasn't a manifesto, but it was environmental recommendations for parties to take note of while they were writing their manifestos, from organisations with a combined total membership of 7 million people. So, there was quite a clear public voice coming through in those recommendations, which I know Duncan has read every word of. And so have other people. And hopefully, that's one way for people to make their wishes more clear to people who are making the decisions in parties. The re-engagement point, I think it comes back to, as an earlier step, it's the trust issue. If people feel that politics are too distant and nothing to do with them and they can't influence them, the first thing they're going to do isn't join a party, although I agree with you, it'd be marvellous if everybody did, but that's not where we are. There needs to be that reconnection. There needs to be putting the public back into public policy. Has to happen. We can look abroad at other countries who are doing a better job. France hosts much more inclusive debates about core policy issues with real people, real voters, normal people with no policy experience or knowledge. And there's other countries that take different approaches, and that's where we need to be looking for some lessons that we could apply here. And I think that will cure some of the disease we've got of lack of engagement.
Matthew, final point for the EiC, is it?
Yeah, I just wonder if in our report on smart technologies, which we released today and which was discussed in a session earlier, there's a bit in that about how one of the potential benefits of smart technology is to bring the citizen into play more. And I wonder if that may take, maybe part of the answer. So in terms of, there's a website, spacehive.com, which allows people to influence choices about the use of green spaces in their communities and help raise funding to redevelop parks and so on. And although we tend to see technology as something which is, taking Charles's point, taking us further away from nature, part of what we tried to do in our report was think about ways it could actually improve the environment. So that's worth looking at, I think.